in control of these newspapers, okay? But they're not purely the authors of the whole thing. These authors are, first of all, from the kind of backgrounds you would expect. The editors had been authors. They'd worked in the publishing industry. They'd worked in newspapers. They were teachers, okay? What we'd say belletristic background, okay? They knew how to write. They knew how to edit. So obviously that's a certain kind of pre-war background for these editors. Second of all, about half of them are officers and about half of them are lower ranks, okay, in terms of that power dynamic on the editorial team. For all British, French, and Germans, pretty much the same kind of split. And finally, they were older men. By the time that the majority of soldier newspapers are up and running, so mid-1915, the armies that the British, French, and Germans entered the war with in 1914 are gone. Okay, by mid-1915, we're now dealing in a new era of replacement armies. Okay, everybody's dead, and now it's a new force that's come in. And there's been a learning process that divides by age in all three armies. Who's at the front and who's doing stuff at the back. The young guys that can run fast across no man's land are in the trenches, and the older men who don't get across no man's land as fast, they're behind the lines, logistics, cooking, editing newspapers. Okay, so we know that these are a group of men who are naturally older, tend to be more conservative in certain ways. For one thing, they have families and children and have a lot more to lose. Okay? And they don't have the hot-headed emotions of the young men at the front. This is how the German staff, for instance, speaks about these people. Okay? We're going to have to be safer hands if we have older gentlemen in the back here running things. But older working class men, older men from various backgrounds. All of them, all the editorial teams write editorials in their newspapers saying that their connection to the soldiers is crucial. They see themselves as a way to speak for soldiers. They're not some top-down propaganda machine. They will only exist to represent the feelings of their comrades. They're all comrades together. You guys are fighting at the front. We've served at the front. Now we happen to be in these offices, usually within 30 kilometers of the front. Maze metric, 20 miles of the front. Audience, always think of audience, right? Usually within 20 miles of the front, these editorial offices. We know what it's like in the front line. We get shelled like you guys do. We're all together in this, and we want to represent your voice as well. Constantly saying that in their editorials, because they know that these newspapers won't be read by the soldiers. They won't be popular unless they're speaking in some way to what these soldiers believe. So, those are the editors. Production and distribution, in terms of numbers here. First of all, in late 14 is when they start appearing. So the line is solid by about October on the Western Front. I am going to speak about the Eastern Front as well, because I'm talking about the German army as well. But for the most part, we're dealing with the Western Front, because I'm talking about the British and French as well today. That line is pretty solid by about October 14. They're settling in, it's looking like a long war, and already in late 14, we have handwritten leaflets nailed to trees near the trenches. Okay, these are the first moments of these trench newspapers appearing. And then into early 15, we have the kind of mimeograph machines, kind of gelatin, you spread on, push down, put in a piece of paper, push down one by one, and you can crank out several hundred copies doing that until you run out of gelatin usually. By mid-15, all three armies have realized they're there for a long time. They all have some level of medium-sized city somewhere near the front, and those medium-sized cities usually have abandoned printing presses in them. So they find these old newspaper buildings, and they actually get to use proper printing presses. So by mid-15, you're getting much more professional-looking newspapers. As things develop, the British and the French end up creating their newspapers and then sending the requirements all the way back to London and Paris to get it really nicely done and then mailed back forward to the front. The Germans never ended up doing that. They have Lille okay, in northeastern France, good-sized city. They end up doing a lot of publishing there. They never send it back to Berlin. The Germans keep it a bit closer to the front line. So that's how they're being produced. The numbers for the British forces, the British and Dominion forces, 107 distinct titles. So any soldier newspaper can be representative of a battalion, a division, all the way up to army level. Okay, there's all different various levels and formations that have their own newspapers. So on the British side, 107 distinct papers appear over the course of the war, but none of those newspapers ever achieve printing runs of more than 5,000 a month. Okay? On the British side, you have about 100 different unit newspapers, none of them much more distribution than about 5,000. So the British was the smallest amount of soldier newspapers in the war. And it's very fair to say that the majority of British troops never saw a soldier newspaper. The French, at least 200 distinct titles. And in terms of numbers, in 1916 it's calculated that between 100 and 130,000 newspapers, all titles together. So in total, about 130,000 are being printed per month by 1916. Again, less than half of French soldiers probably saw these newspapers. All right? German story, completely different. 115 distinct titles. I had to do a bunch of math to figure out that monthly number, and for a historian, that's a tall task in any situation. I use a calculator. And I did a bunch of math to figure out the numbers, and they're astonishing. For the year I took was 16-17, over a 12-month period, I had, on the Western Front, 1.1 million newspapers being printed per month for 3 million soldiers. Okay, at any given time, the average number of German soldiers on the Western Front, 3 million. So, much bigger already than the Allied examples. But the real saturation is on the Eastern Front. On the Eastern Front for the same period, 2 million newspapers per month for 1 to 1.5 million German soldiers. So that really is a standout. That's massive saturation. How do we account for that? Nothing else to read on the Eastern Front. So the British and the French, especially, first of all, for the French always had all their national and domestic newspapers available in every town. Okay? French soldier newspapers had to compete with all the local domestic newspapers. You're in France, you're defending in France, local towns are French. British, a lot of domestic papers are sent over. They have access to a lot of other reading material. The Germans on the Western Front, a lot of German newspapers get to them. It's just not that far, okay? And a lot of German soldiers, especially officers, can read French, okay? They have access to all kinds of material. All of this is not true for German soldiers way out on the Eastern Front, okay? They have no local languages, if there was any material to read. It takes 2 weeks for a letter from home to get to German soldiers on the Eastern Front. Same thing for for home front newspapers. They needed a lot of reading material, so these newspapers are incredibly important.